Once upon a dream, double the fun. The woods were definitely changing. Aurora and Philip could no longer see the sky at all because of the ancient tall trees that stretched far ahead. Pines and other shaggy bark species shot 100 feet straight up on massive trunks, some of which were as thick around as a small house. The canopies that spread out to their tops blacked out most of the sun. Only a rare dappled shaft made it through, but it didn't feel claustrophobic. The absence of light kept the underbrush low. Moss on ancient fallen logs, puddles of shade flowers, mushrooms, and tiny lilies. It was airy and endless, like the largest cathedral ever imagined. The prince and princess walked with light hearts, tiny figures in this primeval world, seemingly the only ones in it. "We are now getting close to the heart of the forest, where the cottage should be," Philip said cheerfully. "It doesn't exactly look like it does in the real world, but it's close enough. We could get there by late tomorrow morning." But the more deeply they progressed, the more her memories came back. Like suddenly being whacked on the head by a small rock, a crystalline image would explode in the insides of her mind, and she would reel for a moment. A hand that looked like hers but smaller, reaching for a perfect late spring flower. A surprisingly large and yellow pollen-covered spider suddenly dropping out of its hiding place in the blossom center. Her aunts not understanding the innate fear she had of a loud, violent thunderstorm, impatient and almost looking like they might rather be out there themselves, but rocking her nonetheless, cuddling her close, uncomprehending but loving. A sudden glimpse on one of her forest walkabouts at the edges of things. The end of the forest, the turrets of a castle. Not only did the images come faster and longer, but each one raised a host of immediate questions and realizations that Aurora couldn't stop. Why was I never brave enough to travel all the way to the castle? Holy crow, that was my castle! Wait, the real one, without the thorns. And then the headaches would begin in earnest. Sometimes it wasn't a single image, but a string of memories connected by a feeling or a thought. These hit her less like a rock and more like an angry bull slamming her head and grinding her innards with its sharp hooves. Like her studies, one of her aunt's whims. Several months of practicing beautiful runes and became gold no matter what she drew with, ink and quill, chalk on rock, stick and mud. No problems at all remembering and copying them. Some flurry of realization from her aunts and then a replacement. 25 ugly letters that stayed the same color as the ink. These were just as easy to remember as the golden ones, though, and it was all a game. Not like learning in the world of the Thorn Castle. Not at all. The few things the fairies bothered to teach her came as easily as singing. As the new/real memories revealed themselves, Aurora Rose found she had a growing collection of 2 different versions of the same scene, the same day, the same year, both of which forgot for space and dominance in her mind. She remembered being a young teenager, bored for days on end in the middle of the woods, impatient for something to happen, trying to hunt with the foxes, climbing trees as high as she could, lying in despair at their bases, no longer loving the happy mindless burble of her aunts as they worked together to make dinner or wash the clothes. Its sister memory in the Thorn Castle was of young Aurora confronting her neglectful parents, who, worse than being enraged by her sight, worse than ordering her out of her presence, just didn't care. Like she wasn't worth getting upset about. She found an empty room in the keep and collapsed on couches for days, wondering what would happen if she died. Would anyone notice? She became hungry and would sometimes rally to find a bit of food, and she grew very, very dirty. She didn't have time to succumb to these memories, to pass out, to be weak, to throw up and recover and stumble a few steps and then collapse again. Philip had said that if she didn't have any more spells, they'd be there in a couple of hours, and he was very patient. But she wanted to go on. Sometimes concentrating on the one lovely thing about each memory helped her remain upright. Like the foxes. She had hunted with foxes, beautiful red-coated beasts who sometimes tangled under her feet like cats and let her scratch their throats. That had really happened. Focusing on her beauty kept her walking, shakily, and kept her stomach from reeling. Sometimes concentrating on one enraging thing kept her going. How could the woman who had loved her and rocked her and raised her lie to her for 16 years? How could anyone do that and still claim to love you? They could have told her the truth, that she was a princess in hiding, and at worst, it would have been a lovely game for her to play when she dressed up. At best, it would have been a distracting, interesting thing to ponder on her most monotonous days. The jolt of fury about her false childhood in the woods and her aunt's betrayal of her trust was far stronger than her body's weak inclination to black out or lose breakfast. It even quickened her pace some. But after several hours, even that was getting hard to keep feeling worked up about, and she found herself beginning to stumble. "I think we'd better call it a day," Philip suggested. "It feels like it's getting late. Maybe an hour before sundown. Let's make camp and get an early start tomorrow." She nodded, too tired to disagree or to say anything, to make him feel better or to apologize. She sat there like a limp rag doll while he bustled around, pushing piles of unbelievably long, unbelievably soft pine needles into spring mattresses, and clearing them entirely out of one area for a small fire. When he had the tinder in a nice little pyramid structure of twigs set up, he coughed politely and pointed at it. She nodded and flicked her finger. In a moment, a cozy bright orange fire was flickering, the only tiny light in the whole twilight forest. Summoning a whole cottage might have been nicer, but it would have taken a lot more time and too much out of her. Probably. She still wasn't sure how it all worked. She didn't even have to snap her fingers or blink to make 2 bowls of porridge appear. Philip tried not to sigh, but took it as gratefully as he could manage. "I think I understand a little how Maleficent's magic works," she said after a moment, thinking about magic. "The events are different, but the feelings are the same." She continued slowly, trying to put it to words that made sense. She worked with what was already in my head and just gave it new pictures. Sort of. My confinement in the castle was based on the feeling of being trapped, with no place to go, figuratively or literally. Nothing to do but pace my cage until I died. She built an entire world around that premise, to keep me asleep and under my control. But in a weird way, she was the most interesting thing that happened to me in either life. The direction her thoughts were taking was obviously making Philip uncomfortable. She finished his porridge, still hungry, but not necessarily eager for more. He stretched back, despite his desire to press on. He was exhausted as well. "Hey," he said, suddenly sitting up eager. "Can I see your sword? The one you summoned?" Glad to have something she could reward his patience with, she handed it over with a smile. The prince pulled out his own to compare. "It's truly amazing," he said, running his fingers over each. "A perfect copy." "Funny," I said. Never paid attention to swords before, not even yours." "Well, I didn't wear it openly when I traveled. I kept it under wraps, as it were. This is the sword of a royal prince, the son of a king. My father had made it for me when I turned 16. It would be dangerous to display openly." "Dangerous to wear a sword where you can get to it quickly?" "I am an extremely skilled swordsman," Philip said gently, "but no match for a band of highwaymen. A feisty noble lad on a horse they might be willing to let pass. The son of a king is good for quite a bit of ransom." "Ah," Aurora said, nodding. "So that's why I didn't see you with it when—" She frowned, trying to bring up the memory. "When—" Philip watched her uneasily. "I never saw you with the sword," she said flatly, "because you kept it hidden." Philip had a very unprincely look on his face, only she didn't find it very funny at all. "You never told me you were a prince." "I was going to tell you," he protested. "I was going to tell you that night, in fact." "That night?" she demanded. Despite her physical exhaustion, she stood up, rage flushing her body straight, her fists clenched of her own accord. "Why not, immediately? Just when was the right moment? Rose, listen." He stood up and took her hands. He whipped them out of his fingers. "I was traveling that day to my father's castle. I was going to be formally introduced as a son-in-law to your parents and the rest of the court, to say hello to a bride I had never met, and goodbye to a life I had barely begun to enjoy." "So," she demanded, "you decided you would have one last fling with some village girl or woodsman's daughter before being forced into a life of marriage?" "No! Listen, I am a prince. Outside of high-born ladies and princesses and what have you, you can't tell anyone you're a prince. No one likes you for just who you are. Girls, they assume, everyone thinks they can get something if they have a prince." His cheeks grew pinker, and he began to stutter as he tried to explain. It did not change the severe look she gave him. As soon as you tell a girl you're a prince, they're just all over you, he said desperately. In the wrong way. They just hear prince and think riches or whatever. Especially if they get, if there's a... Look, can we leave it at that? No, we can't, the princess said. You were, the one person I thought I could trust. The one person from my past, my real past. The love I forgot. Her lips began to twist, and she felt her nose seize up with incipient tears. And it turns out even you, lied to me. Like everyone else in my entire life, no one has ever told me the truth about anything. Not even you. Well, I didn't know who you were. Really, that you were a princess. Not my fault, she snapped. I didn't know that either. Don't you dare think of blaming me or comparing us. Philip took a deep breath. He looked up and around, as if trying to gather help from the sky or the air or the trees around him. I'm sorry. I really am. I realize there's no way to prove this to you now, but the day of Princess Aurora and Prince Philip's wedding, I told my dad I wasn't marrying the princess. I was marrying the peasant girl I met in the forest, because everything else in your life might have been a lie, but my loving you isn't. She didn't say anything. She just glared at him, trembling with rage. I'm going to sleep now, she said through clenched teeth. I'm putting both swords between us. I hope you cut your elbow. They lay down on their pallets, Philip sadly and wearily, she jerkily and angrily. She covered herself with pine needles. Then he started to offer her his cape. She growled, Don't you dare. He sighed and wrapped himself up. Good night, he whispered. She turned herself on her side away from him. It was a long time before she finally fell asleep. The next morning felt like just the sort of new beginning she needed. Nothing was weird or indicative of anything magical or evil. She breathed in the clean air and listened to the breathtakingly still silence of the ancient forest. She looked up at the trees, feeling tiny and incredibly lucky and special. Small birds hidden somewhere in the lightning, not gloom, made little echoey chirps. She was overcome with a desire to stay. This was nice. Here it was beautiful, and she had incredible powers. Who knew what the real world held for her when all of this was done? Forgive me yet? And then all of the exhaustion and emotion stress from the day before came crashing back down on her shoulders. Philip was on his side, chin resting on his head, looking at her and trying to be fetching. Aurora Rose grunted unprincessly and wished she had covers so she could roll over and pull them aggressively over her head. Please? He asked, smiling winningly. He didn't quite bat his eyelashes. Let's just get this done, she said, meaning find the fairies, figure out how to defeat Maleficent, and wake up. And then deal with whatever aftermath this was. Were the two of them still engaged as prince and princess? What was she going to say to her parents? Everything made her irritable. Why couldn't he just have stayed asleep longer and let her enjoy the peace of the forest by herself for a few minutes? The rare peace of her own deep, innermost thoughts. "Aw," he said with a pout. "What about a kiss? And I'll eventually forgive you kiss?" She stared at him, one eyebrow raised like Maleficent. The rest of her face was very un-Maleficent-like, mask of shock and horror.